Hello, my name is Gillian Tabor. I'm a chartered physiotherapist and I specialise in the treatment and the rehabilitation of horses. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about the head and neck position. There is a little bit of debate around the head and neck position, what's optimal and what you want to try and achieve. And there are some sort of arguments for or against different positions. Hopefully I'll present some of those as I go through. But the position and the posture that I'm talking about is when we're working our horses in hand during groundwork, so they're unridden and they're unrestrained. So we're not going to be talking about using training aids to create a head and neck posture. I'm also not going to be talking about postures that are required for certain competitive disciplines. So for instance, in dressage, it is an expectation that your horse would have a head and neck position that would be sort of on or just in front of the vertical. Or perhaps, in show jumping, we expect the horse to lift its head and neck up so that as it approaches a jump, then it can sort of make certain calibrations to jump the fence effectively. So I'm not going to be talking about that. And the other thing to consider is that we're not thinking about head and neck in isolation. And although I am going to be talking a lot about, where the level of the head is, hopefully I'll talk you through a little bit about the rest of the body as to why this is important. So I'm not thinking it as sort of in a reductionist view that you put the head and neck in the right position and everything will be magically fixed. No, that is not the case. I'm sort of thinking about how we can use a positive head and neck posture to influence the rest of the body. And hopefully by understanding why it's the sort of the one of the keys to optimal movement, then it'll help you when you're training your own horse. So when the horse is loose, the head and neck can go in sort of any position. And quite often we're talking about, or people are saying, have the horse's head and neck long and low. And that's something that I used to say as well. But I didn't give any sort of constraints about that and why I thought that was a position that you wanted to go in. I used to just say, lower the head and the back will lift and the hindquarters will step underneath. But it's not quite as simple as that. So if we take away all the background from this position and have a chat about the silhouette of how this horse is moving. So yeah, the head and neck is low. And in fact, it is very low. The mouth is lower than the knee. This often is suggested to be, an ideal position when you're rehabbing your horse. So what happens when the head and neck goes low? Well, we have traction on the nuchal ligament. So that is a very, very strong soft tissue, connective tissue rather, that runs from the poll sort of between the ears and then to the withers. So there's various portions of this. There is the funicular portion, which is a cord that runs along sort of just underneath the crest, and then you've got the lamellar portion that comes off that and attaches onto the individual cervical vertebrae, sort of from mostly in the upper neck region and less so in the lower caudal neck region. So that nuchal ligament at the withers then blends with the supraspinous ligament that runs over the tips of the spinous processes. So what we get when we lower the head and neck is traction on the ligament that goes over the top of the spinous processes. So that actually has the effect of rotating the spinous processes, so there's long bony projections in the wither region, so it rotates those forwards, and therefore you end up with a lifting of the back, because actually it is connected all the way through to the tail. Now, this is evolutionary quite a clever idea, because when the horse's head and neck is down, it's grazing, and we know that wild horses used to spend many, many hours of their day having to graze. And what that would do is it would then create some passive support of the trunk and the abdominal content, so it would sort of hold them up as the back was lifted. We also want the back to be lifted in certain disciplines such as dressage, and obviously when we're carrying a rider, we know that the back goes into a slight extended, a lowered position when we put a rider on board. So ultimately we want the horse to be able to lift and carry us underneath the saddle and underneath the weight of the rider. But there are sort of consequences to having the head and neck quite so low, and one of those being that we increase the body weight through the front legs. And as a sort of a counter argument to having the head and neck quite so low, I would say that we don't want to force more weight through the forehand. We're aiming for, in an ideal world, this sort of golden chalice of the weight shifting to the hind legs. So in sort of nature, as a horse is moving and walking along, we know that they have about 58% of their body weight on the forehand. When they go on uphill, that reduces to 56, sort of 54%. More weight is taken through the hind leg. But when the horse's head and neck is lower, we get a shift of the center of the mass forwards, and we get more weight going through those front legs. So it's not my optimum position to have the head and neck this low. When we are thinking about lowering the head and neck, we do have some research that supports this idea. If we look at the top picture on the left, that is a neutral head and neck position, and the one in the middle is a low head and neck position. That creates flexion of the thoracic spine, and that actually increases the distances between the spinous processes. And we know that either in situations where we have an inverted position or a high head and neck position, as shown in the picture on the bottom left, we end up with those gaps between the spinous processes becoming narrowed. Now, any of you that are aware of the spinal pathology overriding dorsal spinous processes, or kissing spines, know that the issue is the reduction in space, or in fact the abolition of space between those spinous processes. So it makes sense that either in the sort of prevention, lowering the risk of kissing spines, or perhaps in the management of horses that have got kissing spines and the pain has been addressed either through conservative management, medical management, or through surgery, that we want to increase those spaces between the spinous processes. And this is one of the reasons that we consider lowering the head and the neck position. We know that when we look at a horse that has a very low head and neck position, and these are just still shots taken from a video of my horse doing a baited movement, also known as a carrot stretch, where they're taking their nose between the fetlocks, we can see that the back lifts and comes up into flexion. And that is obviously a positive ideal for that region. But as I've just alluded to, I'm not particularly keen on the nose going really low. So, down towards the level of the knees or even lower than that. What we end up with in a very, very low position, and if I can just pause the video, is a positive effect on the spine, and also we have a weight shift to the forehand. But the other factor that we have is we have relaxation of the muscles in the base of the neck, which is again a very positive ideal. But let me see if I can stop it when he goes really low. Oh no, I can't. That's no good, is it? Is that we end up with a change in the activity of the muscles around the neck. So when the horse's head is high, we get activation of the muscles in the base of the neck. And I talk through this more in another video that I have done, speaking about the inverted, hollowed and extended posture. So lowering the head of the neck actually then reduces the tension in the muscles at the base of the neck. But what I find is the horses that work in a very, very low position is they end up sort of just hanging on the passive structures of that nuchal ligament, and they don't actually use the muscles actively as much as they do when the head is in a more neutral position. And again, that is an evolutionary advantage, because you don't want to have to use muscle when you don't have to. So if you can just hang on a ligament and not actually actively switch on and recruit the muscles being worked, then that is of benefit. So I'm just going to share this with you, that my sort of optimum position for the horse when they are working in hand through groundwork and through sort of in hand work is roughly, and I say roughly, but with the ears level with the withers. How do you know when you are in the right position? Well, what you'll see is that you'll see the muscles on the base of the neck switch off. They will become floppy and soft, and you will get a little bit more sort of activity through the muscles around the back and through the abdominals, and then the horse will go through that position of engaging more, so stepping under. We know that when the horse's head and neck is lower in this sort of free, unrestrained position, they actually have a longer stride length. And when they have a longer stride length, they actually then have to have more lateral bend through their body. So it oscillates with their ribs swinging from left to right. So the ribs will go left as they step through with their right hind, and the ribs will go right when they step through with their left hind. And we know that from the series of studies that look at both the ridden and unridden horse with a variety of head and neck positions. So I've got some pictures here of my sort of horse working in that position, and he's unrestrained and he's in a neutral head and neck position, and I like to call this a sort of a positive head and neck position. Now your horse might have to have a slightly lower position than this to get that switching off of the base of the neck, and depending on the sort of degree of in-hand work you are doing, you know, if you're asking for collection, then that thoracic sling will be more active, the hind limbs will be more engaged, and if you are early on in your sort of retraining or training in hand, then you might have a slightly lower head and neck position. But just to sort of repeat the message that I prefer not to have the nose sort of down by the knees or down by the fetlocks. So just in summary, we know that the head and neck position has an effect on the whole of the body, that certainly through that thoracic region and thinking about the distances between the spinal processes. We also know that the head and neck position has an effect on the stride length. It also has an effect on the intervertebral movements, both in the ridden and the unridden horse. And we have to think there's sort of the consequences of sort of long time in this position. So if your horse is in a sort of advanced level training, then you might opt, you might choose this position during warm up, or you might select to do some in hand or some groundwork, once or twice a week, in between your ridden stages where you're asking your horses to have a more up position. You might also, if your horse isn't in sort of dressage training as such and being in a more sort of formal fixed environment, you might think about the height of your head and neck position when you're out hacking or on the trails, and then also thinking about other sports and thinking about the freedom of the head and neck and what effect that has on the rest of the body. And then how to train this position. So you saw me in that video, I was using pressure and release, so negative reinforcement to achieve the head and neck position, but you can also use reward-based training, so positive reinforcement, target training. You can use that idea of capturing the moment when the horse is in the nice position and then providing a positive reward such as scratching or even a food treat. There are lots of different ways, and there's lots of information out there on the internet and through the training forums that Shaw's we're all members of. But if you want to ask me for my help, you can contact me via my website, which is gilliantabor.co.uk. I'm on Facebook as the Equine Physio and Rehab, or also available on Instagram and Facebook as Dr. Gillian Tabor Physio. So I hope that helps and gives you sort of an idea of what a positive head and neck position entails, and so my opinion on what I think is sort of optimum to use when we are in training.